Probably most of you listening will remember the shining Sunday morning of the 3rd of September 1939, the first of a series of Sundays whose beauty mocked the thunder that they carried around the world. The Sunday of the Nazi invasion of Russia, the Sunday of December the 7th, 1941, the Sunday when the Security Council, in the boycotting absence of the Russians, voted to go into Korea. For Americans, the most poignant Sabbath in living memory until today was that Sunday afternoon, a flawless day across 3,000 miles, when the normal, huge radio audience was settling down to listen to the New York Philharmonic play a Shostakovich symphony. The opening chords had just sounded when an announcer broke in with the news that the Japanese had bombed Pearl Harbor. More people than would now care to confess wondered where Pearl Harbor was. They knew well enough the next day, and for the 3.5 years thereafter. These were all beautiful Sundays that brought the worst kind of news. Today was, on this seaboard, another jewel of a day, one of those New York days that are as crystalline in January as they are in June or October. Like many millions of other people, I'd put the clock back last evening in order to justify staying up later than usual. A couple came in, the man, a Secretariat member of the United Nations. And between bouts of personal talk, we tuned in the bulletins every half hour in the hope, which seemed last midnight to be draining away, that the United States would not feel it essential to have to use force to destroy the Russian missile bases. More photographs were coming into the Pentagon and being rushed to the White House, and they showed that down below, the Russian technicians and their Cuban help had been working overtime on Friday and Saturday to finish the bases and mount the missiles and confront the United States with that accomplished fact which the President, in the long, long week behind us, had labored to thwart. The bulletins last night kept breaking into the rock and roll and the melancholy vibra harps all through the night. But there comes a point when anxiety must have a stop. And the last two items we heard were that the President had turned down Mr. Khrushchev's offer to trade his Cuban bases for our Turkish ones. And more numbing still, that Mr. Adlai Stevenson had told the delegates of 13 nations, from NATO and Latin America mostly, that unless work on the missile bases was voluntarily stopped, the United States would take military action to eliminate them in a brief space of time. 48 hours was what they said at the United Nations. It was interesting, to say the least, that this apparently ultimate warning, the very last step of brinkmanship, was given not by the President or the Secretary of State or Secretary of Defense McNamara, who had been controlling and articulating the military news out of the Pentagon, but by Ambassador Stevenson, a man who, to paraphrase a famous complaint of Marshal Foch, is a man very well known, but still Ambassador Stevenson. In other words, a courier or servant of presidential policy, but certainly not its maker. A fact that Mr. Stevenson has sometimes found hard to accept, since only 2 years ago, a little more, he seemed a grander figure than the Senator Kennedy who was about to become president. This choice of Mr. Stevenson was, I believe, central to the belief that the world, and the Soviet Union especially, would have in the president's purpose. And I think we ought to go into it a little more. I ought to point out that Mr. Stevenson was the man who, in April of last year, went before the Security Council of the United Nations and defended with passionate sincerity the good faith of the United States, who honestly ridiculed the Soviet charge that the invasion of Cuba, which was then in its earliest stages, had been planned and assisted by the United States. He brought in photo exhibits of captured planes, whose markings showed that they were from Castro's Air Force. Unfortunately, it came out later that similar markings had been faked on planes used in the invasion. Mr. Stevenson had a rough time of it. Then, and often afterwards from Mr. Zorin, the Soviet chief delegate. And Mr. Stevenson had no public way open to him to recover his self-respect. For he had made his honest defense of American motives before he was informed that the abortive invasion was, in fact, an American show. Mr. Zorin brought this up with relish on Thursday evening, when once again Mr. Stevenson brought easels and photographic blow-ups into the Security Council and mounted them and described them in order to force the answer to the question Mr. Stevenson had hammered at Mr. Zorin and which Mr. Zorin airily waved away. That question, in Mr. Stevenson's words, was, "Let me ask you one simple question. Do you, Ambassador Zorin, deny that the USSR has placed and is placing medium and intermediate range missiles and sights in Cuba? Yes or no?" Mr. Stevenson is a man of vast dignity and patience, but Mr. Zorin's face began to crack, somewhere between a smirk and a sigh. And in that split second, Mr. Stevenson leaned forward and rasped out, "Don't wait for the interpretation, yes or no?" Mr. Zorin replied that he was not in an American courtroom and had no wish to answer a prosecutor's questions. "You'll get your answer," he said, without deigning to look at the crouching little figure of Stevenson. "Don't worry," he said. It was at that moment that Mr. Stevenson leaned even further forward and said a sentence which will surely, if only from its repetition in film clips, pass into the lexicon of famous American phrases like, "Don't shoot till you see the whites of their eyes," and "You may fire when ready, Mr. Gridley." "I am prepared," Mr. Stevenson rasped out, "to wait for an answer till hell freezes over, if that's your decision, and I'm also prepared to present the evidence in this room," which he promptly did. Now, in all the long and tortuous sequence of events since the president canceled his Midwest campaign tour on account of that strategic cold in the head, this seems to me to be to coin a phrase, the moment of truth. It was the moment which lots of thoughtful people on both sides of the Atlantic were waiting for. It was the root question they wanted to pluck up and have answered. Mr. Zorin refused to look at the photographs that everybody else was eyeing like eagles. If I'd been talking to you 2 days ago, I should have gone into the detail of those pictures and reported the reliable assurance of photographers, military and Air Force reconnaissance men, and not only Americans, that a trained and disinterested eye was bound to see in them, shot over Candelaria and San Cristobal and Guanajay, unmistakable missile sites and missile equipment and accessories that can be used for no other known military purpose. Since, however, we are talking on Sunday evening, there is no need to stress the point that the chances of these pictures being of cunning camouflage or clever movie sets are about 1 in 1,000. The military say the chances are much less. Mr. Zorin, at the time, was simply obedient to his instructions. "Falsity," he shouted, "is what the United States has in its hands. False evidence, forgeries." Between then and now, Mr. Kruschev himself has given the lie to Mr. Zorin's lie. Only this morning, Mr. Kruschev said to the president, "The weapons you describe as offensive are grim weapons. You and I both know what they are." It is almost a parrot echo of Mr. Stevenson's well-bred snort at the end of Thursday's crackling exchange in the Security Council. "I hope we can stop this sparring. We know the facts, and so do you, sir." You may have gathered from this tremendous scene, which will never be forgotten by those who saw it, that Mr. Stevenson was the logical man to enunciate last night's warning, since he is the man who has carried the American case in the one place where the Soviet Union, the United States, and Cuba are meeting face to face. It is logical, but it is not inevitable. All exchanges with foreign governments, and even with Lord Russell, have been handled by the president. It was left to Mr. Stevenson to give yesterday's warning about the use of force against the missile bases, even to enlarge on it later and say that the first move would be an airstrike, because it was essential for the credibility of the United States before the rest of the world to show that this time Stevenson was in on the most secret information, that he knew, that he believed, and that this time he spoke with both knowledge and good faith. When the history of this, the longest week, comes to be written, I think that the decision to entrust an ambassador, and this ambassador, with the final warning will be seen to be a masterstroke of diplomacy and goodwill. Below the surface of even the most world-shaking political events, the actors remember old grudges and sometimes act blindly or knowingly from the depth of their being. The role that Mr. Stevenson was asked to play, or by default was allowed to play, in the Bay of Pigs disaster was humiliating to him and damaging to the honesty of the Kennedy administration in its first showdown with communism in this hemisphere. In the second, the much more momentous showdown, since it was not between a giant and the other giant's puppet, but between the titans themselves, it was crucial that nobody should infer a clash of wills inside the Kennedy cabinet. When we went to bed last night, we had this small and honorable satisfaction to set against the immensity of the risk, the trembling of the fingers on the nuclear buttons. When we woke up this morning, the glad tidings came pealing in, breaking happily into Mozart and Gilbert and Sullivan and solemn sermons and rollicking hymns up in Harlem. The news that Mr. Kruschev had accepted unconditionally every point of Mr. Kennedy's demand for the dismantling of the Cuban missile bases under UN supervision. We had to wait 4 more hours, by which time the Khrushchev text had been studied at the White House. Before, not much more than an hour ago, the president came through with his warm welcome for an important contribution to peace and his earnest hope that the governments of the world will turn now to the compelling necessity of ending the arms race. This is not the time to review the last week, to mete out blame and recrimination, or study the furious diplomacy of the last 7 days as a possibly perilous precedent for a similar crisis over, say, Berlin. I can only say that if the conditions are met, President Kennedy will emerge in his own country incredibly strengthened as a president and leader. An hour ago, a neighbor of mine, who is a hi-fi buff and mighty proud of an amplifier that practically fills his living room, telephoned me and asked me to listen to the clanging sound of his gramophone. He was playing "Oh, What a Beautiful Morning." It was corny, but it was spontaneous and good. And I looked out over the riffling waves of the reservoir in Central Park. A bird backlashed to the water and was airborne and soared off to the land and a high elm. I should like to say it was a dove. It was, however, a seagull, and its clean, swinging flight is also, I imagine, a tiny thing I shall remember till the day I die.